but for real this time. Action. Today I am doing my February reading wrap up for the entire month. I surprised even myself and I ended up reading 21 books. 21 books. In just 28 days. There are 4 books that I'm not going to be talking about in this reading vlog, but that I will be revisiting later on in the year, so keep your eyes out for that. So today I'm going to go through the remaining 17 books that I read this month, tell you a little bit about each one, my likes, dislikes, etc., and then I will give you my rating out of 5 stars with a little bit of my reasons why. Our first book was Highly Suspicious and Unfairly Cute by Talia Hibbert. This book honestly was as close to 5 stars as I have gotten so far this year. Because it was young adult, it had a little bit less of the intrigue than what I usually like to see in my romances, but everything else was just top notch for me. It was 2 great characters, really well thought out supporting characters. All in all, it was really great. This is the story of Bradley and Celine. Bradley is a bisexual teenage boy who also suffers from OCD, and Celine is the younger child in a single mother household, and they both end up entering a competition to win a scholarship to go on to university. I really loved the way that Bradley's OCD was represented, and at the end in the author's note we do get an acknowledgement from Talia Hibbert that she also has OCD. I myself also have OCD, and I was really interested in how she would portray this in Bradley. He has contamination OCD, so if that is a trigger for you, I do recommend avoiding this book. What I did find really sweet was that Celine remembered from when they were younger certain things that would help him navigate his OCD before he really went through intensive therapy, and I think that that really underscored the fact that they had a friendship before they got to high school, and really the fact that she did care about him even after all of this time. I will definitely be putting this on my shelves in the future so that the students I have can access it if they are so interested, but I do want to include that one note about the contamination OCD if that's something that you also struggle with. Okay, next up we have my second nonfiction book of the year, which I listened to on audiobook, and that was The Witches by Stacy Schiff. Stacy Schiff is really well known for her nonfiction works. However, it was pretty difficult to listen to this one, in all honesty. It might have gone better if I was reading it and if it was a subject that I had some in-depth prior knowledge on. However, I don't know much about the Salem witch trials aside from The Witch of Blackbird Pond, which I read when I was younger, and I think that it really hindered my experience with this book. I did like the narrator of the audiobook that I listened to, however, it was pretty long. It was 18 hours long, and I was mostly listening to it on long drives, and at one point I actually re-listened to an entire 3-hour chunk without realizing it until I got to the very end and realized I had already heard that before. There were definitely some times that I could feel myself tuning out a little bit just because it was so incredibly dense with information. It was very informative. I would recommend it for somebody who has a significant special interest in Salem and the witch trials. But for the average person who just wants to know a little bit more, it might be a bit overwhelming. My rating ultimately ended up at 2.75 stars, which is honestly not bad from me. The writing style was just too dense and it brought it down to 2.75. So now we have some repeats from my Valentine's Day video, so I'm not going to go too in-depth with them. I'm just going to say what I liked about them and their final 5-star rating. So first we have Wilde in Love by Eloisa James. I ended up checking out the next 2 books in this series because I did really enjoy it. Ultimately, it was a fake-to-real relationship trope that I got from the library. It had a fun twist in it with the addition of an unexpected character, and then it also was a bit of the taming the rogue who wasn't really a rogue storyline. So for those who are fans of historical fiction, I would definitely recommend, and it got a 3.75 stars from me. Book number 4 for February, 4 of 17, was The Feeling of Falling in Love by Mason Deaver. Now, when I was reading the inside flap of this, I am pretty sure I said the words, "oh no," about 5 times, and I had to edit some of those out because it was so many. There were quite a few different aspects layered into this story. Overall, I found it pretty charming, if a bit unbelievable, especially towards the end. I cannot specifically speak to the trans representation myself, but after reading several reviews by trans readers, I do believe that this is a relatively good representation of a teenage trans boy and the feelings that he experiences. There is also another character who talks about their identity, their gender identity in the book, and most of the reviews said they felt that that was handled well from the queer point of view. The main character I thought was pretty unlikable, and that really held me back from giving this book a super high score, but I did think that it was good representation for teenagers and overall a sweet story, so I gave it a 3.5 stars. Book number 5 was honestly a disappointment for me. It was part of the Learning to Love bound duology, I guess you could call it, and the book itself was called Love by Degree. I didn't like a few things about this book. First of all, it was written in the 1980s, and it definitely read like it was written in the 1980s. There were a couple of things that I didn't like about it. One of the first things was our female main character, Ellen. I just felt like she was very insecure, and she took that out on our male main character, Reed, in a couple of different ways that just, to me, were not good examples and didn't really sit well with me. I also did not like that there was implied cheating in this book where our main character, Ellen, was the other woman. And quite frankly, the way that it was written, she was perfectly okay with that. She essentially said to Reed, "I will just pretend that your almost fiance doesn't exist, and if you want to go on dates with me, then great." So not a hit for me. Again, it's a bit dated, and it reads as though it is dated. So if you are from the 1980s and that's when you were in college, you might enjoy this. Otherwise, I would say it's definitely a skip. It only got 2 stars from me, and that was probably me being generous. Book number 6 is actually one of my favorites that I read. It is one of my first graphic novels of the year, and that is Iranian Love Stories. This is by Jane Duard, and that is a pseudonym for a pair of journalists who are in a couple. This was originally published in France in 2013, and it was recently translated to English and published in the States in 2021. It is a series of nonfiction vignettes that are turned into graphic novel style. The art is beautiful. The vignettes are really interesting, and I think that it's always good to try and see other cultures from their own perspective. So instead of an outside or an external Western perspective looking at Iran, it was actually from the Irani people, and it was younger people, older people, middle-aged people, women who love living in Iran, women who don't love living in Iran, men who love it, men who don't love it, and really just their own struggles with what it means to be in love and still be a part of a culture that really touts the benefits of arranged marriages. So overall, this was a really big hit for me. I definitely took my time reading through it. It's very difficult for a nonfiction to get 5 stars from me because I typically do nonfiction on a whole star scale. So for me, this was a 4-star read. The last of the books from my Valentine's Day video was Season of Love by Helena Greer. I loved this book. This was another almost 5-star read for me. It just barely fell short, but the reason that it did was that the third act conflict for me was pretty predictable. Miriam is the niece of the woman who owned the Christmas tree farm, and Noelle was the Christmas tree farm manager. The aunt of Miriam passed away and left the farm to 4 different people, 2 of which being Miriam and Noelle. One of the reasons that this didn't get 5 stars from me is because of the miscommunication trope. The other is because in the beginning of the book, we actually find out that Miriam is engaged, and it's sort of a relationship of convenience in her engagement. But I still didn't love that she was kind of actively flirting with Noelle while she was engaged to another woman. I did really love the character growth, and I really liked how this book handled some of the more difficult topics that it touched on. I do want to give a trigger warning for parental abuse and alcoholism. If talking about alcoholism is something that bothers you, or if the discussion of abusive parents, not physically, but emotionally and financially, is something that will bother you, I would unfortunately say to skip this book. But if you think that you want to give it a try, it was so good. And I ended up giving it 4.75 stars. Next, we have a string of Kindle Unlimited books. The first one is book number 8, and that is Double Booked by Susan Coventry. Honestly, a very pretty cover, but not a great book for me. I felt like the spice was just not there for what I typically enjoy. But Double Booked is the story of Eden and Cole, and it's actually a forced proximity romance. So they both book the same cabin mistakenly, and when they get there, there are no other cabins available, so they decide to stay in the same cabin together, but it does have separate bedrooms. So if you like a more chaste insta love story, then this is definitely the book for you. I only gave this 1.75 stars, and that's because when I was reading it, it just felt really silly. I usually really like forced proximity, but in this case, like, it was not giving what I want in a contemporary romance book. It really didn't do anything for me, good or bad. Book number 9 for February was Sweet and Spicy by A. Unda Tans. Here is our cover art. So it all takes place in Latin America, and it wasn't awful. I did end up writing a review for this on Goodreads, but it was a pretty short review, to be honest. I liked the gist of the story, and I liked the plot itself. I do wish that we went more in depth on some of the characters, especially our male main character, Diego. There were certain things that we didn't find out about him until well into the story that I think would have had us rooting more for the relationship if we had found out earlier. Additionally, the dialogue was written in a very stilted vernacular, so there were absolutely no contractions used, and that's just not how people speak. So I just thought that kind of took me out of the story a little bit, so that was why I ended up giving this a 3 out of 5 stars. Now an entire series in one weekend. Actually, one day. I read all of the next 6 books all in one day, and they were all written by Honey Phillips, who was my 3rd most read author in 2022. They are all part of the Cyborgs on Mars series. However, I did not read one of the books. It was the reverse harem book in the series. I'm not really a reverse harem girl, and I knew that I would be able to jump to the next book without getting my storyline disrupted too much. I'm going to go through each book individually. There were 2 novellas and 4 full-length novels. So the first book of the series is actually book like 0.5. It is called The High Plains Cyborg by Honey Phillips. So the High Plains Cyborg is basically setting up the series for us. It introduces us to Mars as a brand new colony. It also introduces us to Joe and Clint. Clint is the first of our cyborgs that we see really have a personality, and we hear him remember his human name before he was made into a cyborg. We also learn in this novella that the cyborg program was started through the Army. No surprise there, US military. So when men were too significantly wounded in battle, they would then be volunteered into the cyborg program, and the body parts and the essential organs they had lost would be replaced with these cybernetic parts. I did like this first book, and I actually wished it had been longer. So we find out about Jo and her initial partner that she had moved to Mars with, and we find out that she decides to do their homestead on Mars by herself instead, and then Clint is basically trying to like help her out and watch over her, and then they fall in love. And so I ended up giving this 3.25 stars. I thought it was a good beginning, and it was pretty short, so I didn't get enough of the character development or the plot development as I would have liked, but it was still enjoyable overall. The first full novel in this series is called The Good, the Bad, and the Cyborg. So you can see he has a cyborg arm in this cover. You can also see a little bit of like mountains in the background. So this was Hattie and Morgan's story. In the middle-ish of Jo and Clint's story, we meet Morgan, who is another cyborg that is tasked with the responsibility of basically keeping the peace on Mars. And they are independently contracted like by the US military. So the companies that are on Mars can be regulated. I liked this one. I thought it was like so-so, but it was enough to keep me interested. So our female main character, Hattie, was married to a big name person in the company that is kind of providing like the buildings and the mechanisms and the science for taking over Mars and for building it up to be a livable colony. So I did like that the female main character was a widow. I thought that added a very nice layer to her story, and we do see her husband referenced several times. Her marriage that she became a widow from was a marriage of convenience, and then she actually enters into a partnership with Morgan that is a partnership of convenience. The company is called Gen Con, and this is where we really realize that they are going to be like the main enemy in this series. So Gen Con has a site that they're developing right behind her homestead. The reason that she and Morgan enter into this partnership of convenience is because her deed states that there have to be like 2 people working her property. I do like marriages of convenience, so this was a relatively enjoyable plot line for me. I also was still figuring out the lay of the land in this series and with Gen Con, so the logic wasn't 100% there for me yet in terms of how the story was going to go. So book number 12 of the month, and the second full book in this specific series, is called A Fistful of Cyborg. So this was the story of Sam and Addie. I loved this one. I thought that this was one of the best books in this entire series by far. It was essentially a second chance romance. Addie, our female main character, was a scientist for Gen Con and still is. She knew Sam when he was at the initial lab on Earth being changed into a cyborg. He was actually one of the only people who I believe was a real volunteer at the time. Even though he did have damage done to his body, he was aware of the program and kind of knew what he was getting into. And Addie would come spend the night with him and try to like help him calm down and relax, and they fell in love. She ended up betraying him, and he never understood why. In this book, we find out more about the reasons behind what she did, and Sam has to decide whether or not he can forgive her. This gave us a really great jumping off point for the world building and why we should hate Gen Con as much as we do. I don't want to spoil how the story goes for you, but I will provide 3 trigger warnings for this. If the following things bother you to read about, I probably would not read the series and would not read this book in particular. So the first one that we have is emotional abuse and manipulation by use of the child against a parent. We also have torture, and then we also have a secret child. So if any of those concepts bother you, please feel free to skip this book, but I did give it 4.5 stars overall. The 4th book in the series, and the 4th total book that I read for this, which is called The Magnificent Cyborg. The Magnificent Cyborg was the story of Cherry and Wyatt, and oh my God, was this a good story. Cherry is the madame on Mars, so she does run a brothel. She and Wyatt were married on Earth after they met at a party. He ended up disappearing basically 2.5 weeks after they got married. She was told that he was murdered, and then he shows up on Mars as a cyborg. So yeah, he has no memory of her. He was the first cyborg that they experimented with memory blocking on, and it works for a long time. And she's devastated, and she's trying to figure out, can we rekindle what we had before? Will he fall in love with me again, not having known who I was, only knowing who I am now? Can we recover what we lost? So this for me was A+, hit it out of the park. Ultimately, this did get 4 stars for me. The final full-length novel that we have from this series is The Outlaw Cyborg. So The Outlaw Cyborg is the story of Serena and John. John is a newer cyborg to Mars in this story, and Serena is actually one of our villains. She is very high up at Gen Con, and she is really a great personification of when your personal desires get in the way of making sure that a company is not crossing the line in certain ethical and moral areas. I did like the redemption of her character. I really liked the story arc that she had with John. I also liked that we got to see some of her inner turmoil and why she kept her icy mask so specifically curated for the public. I just don't always feel like they need to get their happily ever after too. Ruby Dixon did this in one of her series, and now Honey Phillips has done it in this one, and for me it's just a so-so trope. So for that reason I gave it 3.75 out of 5 stars. The final installment in this series was a novella called The Cyborg with No Name. The Cyborg with No Name is the story of Rose and Roy. Roy has no memories, similar to Wyatt when he first wakes up. And Rose is the scientist from Gen Con who created the mechanical horses that all of these cyborgs use to patrol. And she left because she felt like her work was being disrespected and people were not understanding what she was really trying to do with her research. She ends up making a cybernetic dog, and it develops its own personality, which is essentially what she was trying to get to the point of researching with her horses. They actually respond to more than just outright commands by their owner. They seem to think on their own and have sort of an AI aspect to them for artificial intelligence. So it was a relatively good wrap up to the series. It gave some of our other characters a bit of a close in their storylines and made sure everyone had kind of a bit of a happily ever after, and also provided some insight to us about the animals that were being held on Mars for different reasons. Overall, I gave this one 3 stars as a decent, if not short, closer to the series. Book number 16 that I'm going to be talking about this month was Waa'aka, The Bird Who Fell in Love with the Sun by Cindy Alvitre. This is the Tongva story of creation. It is a children's picture book. I thought that the illustrations in this were absolutely beautiful. The illustrations are by Carly Lake, and I really enjoyed learning about another creation story from our indigenous people in the Americas. So essentially, the bird Waa'aka falls in love with the sun. They call the sun Temet. And the reason that Waa'aka falls in love with the sun is because she is obsessed with being able to see her reflection. So I did really enjoy this. It is a little bit of a longer picture book by my standards, and I would certainly recommend it to any family that is trying to expand their view on creation and make sure that their children are introduced to different indigenous stories from the people who were here first. The final Kindle Unlimited book and final book that I have for this month is Rajal's Resonance by Ruby Dixon. I mean, look at this cover. So this is the start of a new spin-off series for Ice Planet Barbarians. This is the Ice Planet Clones series, and this is book 1. Some of this might not make sense to you if you have not read the Ice Planet Barbarian series and the Ice Home Beach series, but I'll do my best. So there were an additional grouping of clones that were dropped onto Not Hoth, our ice planet, and Rosalind's story is the first one that we have for these clones. She wakes up first in her pod, does not know that she is a clone, and ends up running away and makes it into a cave. She gets kidnapped by an unknown thing and wakes up in a jail cell. Not good. But Rajal is one of our mainland islanders who ended up in the Arctic area of Not Hoth after the volcano explodes on his island, and he ends up in a cell with a human that does not yet have a kui. So he resonates to her immediately. She has no idea what's going on. She's gonna die if she doesn't get a kui soon enough because it's a symbiotic organism you need to be able to live on the planet. I really liked that Rosalind had a lot of depth despite being a clone and waking up as one. I also really loved the representation they had of her having panic attacks and nightmares in relation to being a clone and not knowing what that means for her as a potential person on this planet. So the implications for what's going to happen in the future are really interesting. There are a whole host of new clone characters that we have to find out about, and all of that is going to be really cool to see. I ended up giving this a 4.75 out of 5. I know, another almost but not quite 5 stars. For me, the reason I love Ruby Dixon is because it is a fated mate situation. However, that does detract a little bit from the intrigue because I know that they're going to end up together. So as much as I enjoy knowing that going into the book, I also am never surprised by it. So it's just a tiny piece of like something missing for me. Those are the 17 books that I'm talking about that I read this month out of the total of 21. So far this year, 65% of my books have been ebooks on my Kindle. That number goes up to 71% if you're looking at my overall digital books, so that would then include the audiobooks that I've listened to as well. So far, I feel pretty good about where my stats are running month to month. I am now ahead of my yearly reading goal of 150 books. If there are any books from my video that you have read and also loved, please let me know down in the comments below. As always, stay safe, make good choices, and have a great night. Bye! I just talked for like 5 minutes thinking that I was recording and I wasn't. And someone just emailed me. Who cares about that at 11:30 at night? My notes! I can't even think of what the company was called now.